a big thank you to Ben Noble, who is the convener of the SSEESing NOW format of the event, and allowing us to use it for today's event. And indeed, we are meeting about events that are really happening as we talk, because today is one of the biggest days of protest against the decision of the Polish Constitutional Tribunal that took place over a week ago, that is on the 22nd of October. That decision of the Constitutional Tribunal deemed unconstitutional one of the reasons for legal abortion in Poland. Poland, of course, as we all know, has one of the strictest abortion laws in Europe, which allows abortion, or allowed abortions for now only in 3 cases. That is when when the pregnancy endangers the mother's life or health, when the prenatal test or other medical findings indicate a high risk that the fetus will be severely and irreversibly damaged or suffering from incurable life-threatening ailment, and 3, when there are strong grounds for believing that the pregnancy was a result of a crime like rape or incest. So here we gathered together to discuss, and the Constitutional Tribunal in its decision last Thursday decided to deem unconstitutional the second reason, so the high degree of risk of fetal impairment. So we are gathered here to discuss the political, legal and socio-cultural consequences of that decision. We have 3 exciting panels, each devoted to political, socio-legal and socio-cultural consequences of that decision. I want to now take a few minutes introducing the speakers and the format of the discussion. We will take questions at the end of each panel. And please, I'll be chairing, and please let me know in the Zoom chat whether you would like to ask a question. I will then have a more sort of an indication how many people would like to ask the question to the panelists, and then I'll be able to group it in some way, so that we do not, so that we can progress and hopefully fit within the 2-hour allotted time. So I'll gather the questions in round, and at the end of all 3 panels, we hope to have another 20 minutes or so for an open discussion. Again, I will be moderating that, so please do let me know in the chat or by raising your hand if you would like to ask a question. So to the speakers, for the first panel that will be looking at the political consequences or potential political consequences, the political context of the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal, I think I couldn't imagine a better round of speakers. First, I'm happy to introduce Carolin Heilig. She's an early career researcher at the Fatigue Project, and her MA thesis at the University of Oxford looked at women mobilization for their reproductive rights during the first strike Kobiet in 2016. Richard Mole is a professor of political sociology at SSEES, and he works at the intersection of gender, illiberalism and populism in Central and Eastern Europe. He's also a scientific director of the Pop Rebel project at SSEES with partners in Central Eastern Europe, Poland and Germany. And Jan Kubik, he's a professor of political science at Rutgers University, and he was a former director of SSEES. He's the president of the Association of Slavic and Eastern European Studies, and he's a principal investigator or PI of that Pop Rebel project that aims to develop a new understanding of the rise of populism in Central and Eastern Europe, particularly the right-wing variety of the populism. And Jan has written extensively at the intersection of anthropology and political science in the context of Central and Eastern Europe. In the second panel, I'm very happy to introduce Katarzyna Andrejuk, who is an associate professor at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology at Polish Academy of Sciences. And for this time, she is visiting us at SSEES, and her project, she's a lawyer and a sociologist, and her project at SSEES looks at Polish entrepreneurs in the United Kingdom. And in the third panel, which will be about the social cultural consequences of the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal, we have Marta Kotwas, who is a PhD candidate at SSEES, and she works towards her thesis on the relationship between political and cultural populism in Poland. And she's also activist leading in the Dziewuchy Dziewuchom London branch. Anna Ratecka joins us from Kraków, from the Institute of Sociology at the Jagiellonian University, and she also works towards a thesis on sex work in Poland. She studies gender, agency, and feminism in Poland, and she's both a sociologist and an activist. And last but not least, a pleasure to introduce Katarzyna Zachenter. She's a lecturer at SSEES, and Katarzyna's work investigates the role of memory and suffering in the creation of new models of national identity in contemporary Poland. So without taking too much time for the introduction, but come on, we have this a fantastic lineup of speakers. The least I could do is to introduce them all. And we will be starting with the first panel on the political consequences of the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal. First will be Jan, then Richard, and then Carolin, and each speaker has 5 to 7 minutes, and I will indicate when the first 5 minutes is over. So Jan, the floor is yours.
It always works better when you unmute yourself. This is empirically proven over the last 8 months. So thank you, Agnieszka, first of all, for taking this initiative and bringing us all together and organizing it. Yeah, I'm really grateful. We decided to divide our tasks in this panel in such a manner that I will start in the most general way. And the general way is that I will try to reflect quickly on populism and right-wing populism to provide the general frame. Quite a few of you know those things, but for those of you who are not maybe studying politics as closely as we do, that hopefully will be useful. So the basic idea is, and I see that Ben Stanley is here, and he's one of the providers of this early definitional work, is that populism is technically not that difficult to define. It has a set in the work we do in PopRebel, we assume that 5 features. So I will go through all 5 features quickly and try to indicate possible consequences of those features. PiS, the ruling party in Poland, displays all of them with, I would say, maybe even frightening intensification of the relying on those features. So the feature number one is the vertical polarization of the people versus the elite. In this idea, and the populism is, first of all, predominantly a form of ideology. In this way of thinking, the people immediately appear as a mystical reality, and the diversity of the society is sort of pushed back, and all conflicts tend to get reduced to a grand confrontation across that single cleavage. And if there are a few sort of truths of sorts in political science, one of them is that the society is much healthier if politics is played across several cleavages, not just one. So what would be the remedy and counter-hegemonic measures would be, of course, the restoration of pluralism of identities and interests, which allows then explicit alliance building between various interests. If you have just mystical people, this whole idea of politics really disappears in the sense. So pluralist politics atrophies, and the interest articulation becomes difficult. Second feature of populism is antagonism, which leads to what I would call Schmittization of politics. Carl Schmitt saw politics as war. So in this case, it is not just that it is polarized, but it is all-out conflict. And that also leads to intense anti-elitism. And the part of anti-elitism is increasingly strongly articulated anti-scientific and anti-expert stance. So what is necessary then in attempt to restore sanity is the restoration of respect for expertise and science, although there are all kinds of issues there also, and revival of what Ziblatt and Levitsky called in the book, simply called How Democracies Die, two virtues of tolerance and forbearance. Third element of populism is Manichaeism. Manichaean vision of the world is that everything is an instance of the struggle of the forces of good versus the forces of evil. So the political field gets redefined as a place of a metaphysical drama of the forces of good versus the forces of evil. Legitimation, Weber reminded us that democracy needs rational bureaucratic legitimation. Legitimation reverts back to mythologization. Mythology becomes the base of legitimation. Re-enchantment of politics. Weber famously wrote about de-enchantment, and now we have re-enchantment of politics, which is particularly clear in the Polish case among all those populisms around the world. So politics competition becomes an existential conflict. So what we would need to do is the de-enchantment of politics, separation of the church and state, for example, and the restoration of trust in science experts. So, for example, doctors should be consulted on the etiology of complicated pregnancy, and sociologists should be consulted on the dangers of underground abortions. And it's not some sort of so-called experts who just sell snake oil on those issues these days. The fourth feature is popular will, which perhaps is the most dangerous feature of populism, because basically it means that direct transmission of people's will to a leader is possible, which leads to a destruction of representative politics and maybe even more importantly, checks and balances. It means erosion of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy means the rule of the people checked by the rule of law. That's the meaning of liberal in this phrase. And this goes out of the window. So, of course, the restoration of the rule of law and, for example, compliance with international treaties that Poland is a part of would be an element of restoration. And finally, horizontal polarization. So that question emerges when the people need to be defined somehow. So the construction of the people, this mystical entity called the people, calls for naming the others. Right? So there will be good people and bad people. And those bad people, tactically, strategically, there's a whole range of possibilities, from refugees to LGBTQ plus people to various aliens and various racially impure people, religiously infidels. And as we can see, given the growing misogyny of this whole construct of right-wing populism in Poland these days in particular, it seems to be also the women are the target. So what needs to be done is, I would say, simply de-demonization of diversity and the demand for respect for legal, political, and cultural protections of diverse human identities and interests. And I think that in the nutshell, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jan, and thank you so much for sticking so beautifully to the town and giving this overall argument behind the what does it mean? What does the rise of populism mean? Richard.
Thank you. So I just want to say a few things about the politicization of homophobia in populist Poland. So I'll be linking back to Jan's presentation on the key characteristics of Polish populism, and then finishing by highlighting how homophobia in Poland is closely linked to traditional understandings of gender, so linking forward to Carolin's presentation. So just to sort of repeat quickly the key characteristics of Polish populism that Jan set out. So you've got the volonté générale, leading to this sort of crude majoritarian understanding of democracy, the Manichaean struggle between good and evil, anti-elitism, and then the thickening of populism with nativist nationalism. So taken together, these characteristics, I think, help explain why the LGBT community is a favorite target of Polish populists, as well as the perfect scapegoat for Polish society's ills. So if we start with the volonté générale and this idea of the resultant crude majoritarian understanding of democracy, I mean, that just sort of means in general that minority voices in general can be legitimately ignored. Secondly, the Manichaean struggle between good and evil. This can sort of be linked very clearly to the position of the Polish Catholic Church. Also, not just the sort of the religious role that the Polish Catholic Church plays in Poland, but also an increasingly political role. And it's the ultimate arbiter of national values, particularly with reference to gender and sexuality. Very recently, in August of this year, a 27-page position of the Polish Bishops' Conference on LGBT issues was published, and they very clearly sort of referred to the moral evil of homosexual behavior and called for conversion centers to be set up to help LGBT people regain their natural sexual orientation. Third element would be the anti-elitism, and in Poland this is sort of very much linked, I think, to sort of anti-EU sentiment. So LGBT rights are closely associated with the European Union and its attempts to promote LGBT equality, sort of in opposition to what are seen as Polish national values. So, for example, Jarosław Kaczyński, in the run-up to the last European elections, referred to the gay rights movement as a foreign import that threatens the Polish nation. So again, this idea that it's not naturally Polish, that it's coming from outside, from the EU, and that it's threatening Polish values. So there's long existed this perception in Poland of a sort of a marked cleavage between Polish and European values, sort of among populist politicians. And the European Parliament has repeatedly criticized the Polish government for its failure to respect LGBT rights. And so following these criticisms, it became a matter of national sovereignty that Poland be allowed to criticize sexual minorities within its borders. So as Agnieszka Graf put it very eloquently, homophobia became the new voice of patriotism. So to be a good Pole was to be homophobic. And then fourthly, and this is, I think, the element of populism that has the greatest impact on LGBT people, is this thickening of populism with nativist nationalism. So populist politicians in Poland use the supposed alienness of homosexuality and its association with Western values to portray LGBT people as disloyal enemies of the state who look towards sort of Brussels rather than Warsaw, sorry. Even more vociferously, they portray homosexuals as a threat to the Polish nation and to Polish values. And there are four key threats that homosexuals are believed to pose to the nation. They are the failure to contribute to the biological reproduction of the nation, this idea that LGBT people don't have children. Secondly, they fail to contribute to the cultural reproduction of the nation. By not having children, they're not passing on sort of Polish cultural values. Thirdly, they don't adhere to national stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. So this idea that the man should be strong and defend the home and the homeland, and that women should play their natural roles as mothers. And then fourthly, that they deviate from sort of shared national norms, particularly with regard to religious values. And so this understanding of homosexuality as a threat to the reproduction of the Polish nation was something that you sort of have heard repeatedly from Polish politicians. Lech Kaczyński, when he was president, sort of argued that widespread homosexuality would lead to the destruction of the human race. So there are numerous examples of how populist politicians in Poland have, and not just in Poland, have constructed sort of homosexuals as a threat to the nation in a bid to legitimize homophobic rhetoric and behavior. And just to finish off, I like to refer to research that I did with my colleague Agnieszka Kubik. So we were aware of a lot of research that looked at the top-down sort of how politicians use this idea that homosexuals are a threat to the nation to legitimize homophobic action. But we wanted to see whether or not populists sort of listening to this sort of rhetoric actually agree with that. So we conducted sort of a research on the basis of 5,000 respondents. And what we found was that among individuals who support populist ideas, the threat that homosexuals are believed to pose to the Polish nation relates primarily to the perception that they undermine traditional gender roles. So defined by the church for the good of the nation, rather than that they are believed to pose a threat to the nation's biological and cultural reproduction. So they were just a sort of a few thoughts I had about how homosexuality has become demonized, as we saw most recently in the Polish presidential elections.
Thank you very much. Perfect sticking to the time. Thank you so much, Richard. And I think very, very prompt comments also, given that today the women who protest the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal announced that it's going to be it's going to be the Rainbow Friday. So there is a widespread solidarity that the resistance to the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal seems to be taking. So very interesting to hear those comments. So Carolin.
Well, thank you for having me. I think building on what what previous speakers have already said, we should really start to think about populism and illiberalism through gender lenses. We've seen that, well, these issues are the first target through this new politicized constitutional tribunal. And I think this ruling in general is like a perfect and jarring illustration of all the things that have kind of happened to Polish liberal democracy since 2015. So we see that the judiciary here is used to implement the will of the ruling party. I'm going to speak a bit about the actual, probably, volonté générale in this case, that there's actually not proper support among the Polish population to tighten these abortion laws. You see this particular issue here being taken through the courts, not through the parliament, where it has not been successful before. We've seen the Black protest in 2016, but also in 2018 and the spring of 2020. And we also see here very much how this willingness to use women's rights as kind of the first issue to exploit, amplify polarization that is underpinning this populist politics. And it's also sustaining this. And as Jan said, this is increasingly becoming more intense. And I think also with the protests, we see that people are not having it. And we see that there is a strong grassroots mobilization, especially also among young Polish women going into this. The underlying image of women here, as Richard already said, is this very heteronormative image of traditional image of families, and this idea that women have to kind of make massive sacrifices for the nation, for the Catholic nation. Because if we think about the actual consequences of prohibiting abortion in cases of fetal impairment, that means that also women would have to, well, are forced to give birth to a child that would not have a brain, or would lack a spine, and would not be able to live. So I mean, this is kind of the sort of torture that is expected from women to give. This polarization and kind of using gender issues is not restricted to reproductive rights. We've seen it on the policy side. We've seen it through attempts to ban sexual education in the cynically called Stop Pedophilia law that's currently still held in parliamentary commission since April 2020. We've seen it in rhetoric. Richard already spoke about the presidential campaign, but we also see it on the institutional side. And I think this is also very important in terms of a liberal democracy. We see increasingly very important state positions filled with hardcore, anti-choice, homophobic, ultra-conservative people. So this goes up to the highest court, but then this is also still ongoing. We've seen it in October with the new Minister of Education, Przemysław Czarnek, who's been appointed, who's outspokenly homophobic, who's been called so-called LGBTQ ideology, neo-Marxism, or linking it to Hitler-German National Socialism. And he also has this very close image on kind of, women being just basically there to give birth to children. So to cite him here, if one gives birth to the first child at the age of 30, then how many of these children can one give birth to? These are the consequences of telling a woman that she does not have to do what God made her for. So we also see this kind of again asking women to contribute to the nation, sacrifice, make sacrifices to God. And another issue here that is still ongoing is the question of who's going to follow the Polish ombudsman, Adam Bodnar, who is responsible for protecting human rights violations, civil rights violations in Poland. After one candidate that was supported by more than 1,000 civil society groups, among them the Campaign Against Homophobia, or also the Women's Rights Center, that's Zuzanna Rudzińska-Bluszcz. After she has been rejected in parliament, PiS put forward the new candidate, their own candidate, Law and Justice MP, Bartłomiej Wróblewski, who's also openly anti-choice. And I think this is also one of the issues that are still ongoing. So we might think of the Constitutional Tribunal rule, but the issue is much broader, and the attacks on women happen on all fronts, basically. And this is also one of the claims made by protesters right now, to make sure that this position is not filled with another PiS fellow, so to speak. Just as I already briefly mentioned, I think there is this very big discrepancy even between what is supposed to be the volonté générale, the general will, the will of the people. And then if we trust polls, we actually see that surveys indicate quite a different story. So in 2019, an Ipsos survey, for instance, showed that only 15% of Poles wanted to tighten abortion laws, and 50% were in favor of keeping the so-called compromise from 1993. And it's even, well, now it's probably even more telling. So there was a survey published in Gazeta Wyborcza, which showed that only 13% of Poles supported the ruling of the Constitutional Tribunal, and more than 50% supported the protesters. And I think it's not just it's not just supporting protesters, but it's also supporting protesters in a time of a pandemic that's picking up speed in Poland as well. So I think this should not be underestimated. To sum up, basically, I think gender is used here to cleverly construct the pure people, the Polish people, and it's used to agitate and polarize. It's making women's decisions over their own bodies a question of morality that determines the fate of the Polish nation. And the vision here of the Polish nation and the Polish women here is really to call them on for tremendous sacrifices that they have to make. And that's kind of their purpose here to do. I only think, though, that the backlash that PiS is facing right now also shows that people are aware that this is not a judiciary decision, but this is a political development. So although this verdict comes from the court, people perceive it as a political stance. And if we look at the latest polls in terms of support that the PiS party has in Poland, this has plummeted over the last days. And I think it will be interesting for us to see how this mobilization plays out in the next elections, which are only in 3 years' time. So I think this is something probably that is very similar to the Black protests in 2016. That was 1 year after PiS got into power and 3 years till the next elections. So I think it is really a question how this mobilization now can actually be sustained, and what are going to be the consequences. But I think these young women that are taking on the streets probably give us really a hopeful sign here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. And I can see that there is already a very interesting discussion developing on the chat. So I would like to invite Łukasz to ask a question, as well as I can see Petra Gausti has been posting some really interesting comparative stuff with the US, and I would like her to take some floor after Łukasz's question.
Yeah,
just before you do ask the question, just a reminder, if you do turn on your camera or speak, this is being recorded, so you will appear in the recording, just to make sure that's okay with anyone.
Don't worry, I'm an actor. I like to be recorded. So basically, well, first of all, it is not good to have a surname that is hard to pronounce even by the Polish people, but still. I would like to ask a question which may be a little bit controversial, especially since we have here people that are actively participating in movements that support women's rights. I would like to ask, to what extent are we still able to call this protest a women protest, or a protest in favor of abortion laws, in favor of women procreation laws, in a situation where currently the protests are mostly anti-law and justice, in a situation where, honestly, I have a feeling that most of the protesters are not even aware of the postulates of the strike Kobiet movement. Should we still, as an sociologists, politicians, politologists, talk about an abortion crisis, and to what extent it has become a real full political crisis?
Thanks, Łukasz. Łukasz Bartoszewicz. Of course, I know how to pronounce your name, and it just disappeared, Łukasz. So, dzięki za szpilę. And can I also ask Petra to come in, and then I will give the speakers time to reflect.
Oh, yes. I don't know if you can see me. Yeah, I was just noting on and trying to put attention of the people to the newest data from the VDEM and saying how what I found most interesting is this use of, so Jan has been speaking about the will of majority, and what we are seeing in Poland, that actually, I mean, both electorally, but also in public opinion, PiS actually does not represent the majority. It's the intervention of the electoral system which allows it to win the election. And so it is actually constrained to use counter-majoritarian bodies such as the Constitutional Court, which is the paradox, which is the leading party using counter-majoritarian body to push through legislation which is unpopular and which does not have the support of the majority. So that was just the point. Thank you.
I think I would like to invite all speakers to respond. Yeah, Jan.
Oh, Martha. Okay, well, very quickly, on the last point, this is really interesting, because we have to remember also that the reforms in the United States, 64, 65, were also driven by the court to a large degree. There was a specific alliance between the President Johnson at that time, the movement, the civil rights movement, and the court. That court pushed it, but we like the direction in which the court pushed it. So there is a bit of the controversy about the role of courts as legislating bodies, of course, but yeah, that's not a new strategy in that sense. But to Łukasz's question, as someone who studies movements, been doing that for whatever, 20, 30 years, 30 maybe, I think it is the strength of the movement, whatever I know about protest movements, that the question you often ask when you see the movement is, are they able to successfully bridge, that's the term that's used in the literature, from their demand to a broader demand, right? And I think there's a certain genius in having the main slogan of the protest, wypierdalać, which means get the fuck out of here. Because now you can see everybody who doesn't like peace wants the peace to get the fuck out of here. And the question, of course, is then a very complicated task for the women organizers who need to find a balance between expanding, scaling up that frame of protest, get out of here, and keeping the question of abortion somehow also, maybe at this point, not in the center, but not forgotten. That's a very tricky and difficult thing to accomplish. But the whole phenomenon of scaling up, I think, is very positive.
Thank you very much. Richard?
Well, actually, I was just going to follow up what Petra was saying about the government not representing the will of the people, and that's also true for sort of LGBT equality. I mean, Poland is often sort of presented as a sort of very homophobic society, but public opinion sort of suggests that about 50% of the population is fully supportive of LGBT equality. I mean, on an EU scale, that still sort of puts it sort of at the bottom end, but even so, it's not quite as sort of anti-LGBT as the government rhetoric would suggest.
Carolin?
I think Marta had a question, if I saw your hand raised.
Thank you. So
No,
I
no,
have.
I actually had something to contribute to the answers, if I may, but I think the panelists should go first. So Carolin, go ahead.
No, I think I can only subscribe to what has been said before. Like this protest kind of extending the question of abortion, I think this is one of the main issues that has to be solved, also probably respectively by the different movements in the different cities. So from my research on the Black protests in 2016, I could see that in some cities, this enabled certain groups, like in Łódź, for instance, Dziewuchom, to become an actually really strong group, to mobilize and sustain, and some of them even like eventually bridging into politics. Whereas I think in other cities like Warsaw, this specific group didn't really grow that big, because there've already been institutions and groups in the field. So I think, probably addressing this question, can we speak about abortion, or what's going to happen? I think it's probably worth looking at various local groups there as well, how they develop, and whether we can see some rise in politicization, mobilization there.
I'm going to give the floor to Marta, but very quickly, because
Okay.
I think we would need to move to the second.
Okay, very quickly. I'm actually going to maybe address some of Łukasz's question in my presentation, because I am focusing on actors. And the thing is, the situation is getting very, very complicated, because we have a multitude of actors, some of which are political parties, some of which are protesters who have various motivations. This is not something I'm going to speak about. Perhaps my colleagues and Katarzyna will to some extent. But one thing that is worth noting is that the demands of the strike has slightly changed. So they were first collated on the 27th of October by just probing participants of the protest in Warsaw, and did include some slogans such as "Get the fuck out with the government." Basically, they demand resignation. And now that the demands have been formalized and published officially on the website, this demand has disappeared. So I'm going to go back to this point later on in my bit. And over to you, Agnieszka, for now.
Thank you so much, Marta. I think I have one more question, which the person who is asking it, Michał, agreed to leave it for the final discussion. So now I think, because it's already 22:04, I think we would need to move to the second panel. So now I'm going to stop being a chair and give the chair rights to Carolin, because I'm going to soon speak. So
thank you, Agnieszka. So yeah, I just got the pleasure to host the second part of our presentation today. And so we have Dr. Katarzyna Andrejuk and then Dr. Agnieszka Kubal, who didn't introduce herself, and who we all owe this great occasion to be here today. And so I would really just like to express our thanks for organizing this. Yeah, Agnieszka is a sociologist. She's an expert in social legal issues, migration, human rights, and also, as I happen to know from my own experience, a wonderful supervisor, just as other people here in the panel as well. So yeah, I would just like to give the floor to Katarzyna now.
Thank you. I have a short PowerPoint presentation, so I will share screen. The current conflict concerns further limitation of access to abortion in Poland. As it was already said, currently terminating pregnancy in Poland is possible only in 2 cases. Other cases of abortion were declared unconstitutional. And my presentation will focus on the politicization of the Constitutional Tribunal. And I will raise 3 issues. First, violating the separation of powers. Second, politicized tribunal as a substitute for the legislature. And third, balancing of constitutional values. The political conflict around the Constitutional Tribunal lasts since 2015. In 2015, the governing party was Civic Platform. The party appointed judges for the tribunal who were meant to take positions after the judges who were about to retire in the future. The problem is that the term of office of the outgoing judges would come to end after the new parliament was elected. This move of the governing party was to secure their influence on the tribunal. It was contested as potentially unconstitutional by Polish non-government organizations. After the Law and Justice won parliamentary elections in 2015, they repealed the law which enabled such appointment, introduced new laws, and appointed new judges as a replacement. The act was proceeded at express pace. In this case, the whole legislative procedure lasted only 7 days. And so the judges appointed in the second phase of this conflict are nicknamed the doubles, doublage, because the positions in the tribunal were already taken by the judges elected by the previous parliament. This move of the Law and Justice Party was also criticized by Polish non-government organizations, as well as by international organizations, for example, the Venice Commission, advisory body of the Council of Europe. The Constitutional Tribunal at that time was not fully controlled by the Law and Justice Party. The tribunal at that time deemed many changes made by Law and Justice unconstitutional. So both governing parties used their parliamentary powers to gain political control over the tribunal, therefore violating the separation of powers between the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature. In these unconstitutional attempts, Law and Justice was more effective. The current composition of the Constitutional Tribunal is controlled by the governing party, Law and Justice. This situation lasts despite numerous protests and criticism from international and supranational organizations, the European Union, Council of Europe, and the European Network of Councils for the Judiciary. The second point is politicized tribunal as a substitute for the legislator. In 2016, the parliament controlled by the Law and Justice made an attempt to introduce laws which would completely ban abortion in Poland and penalize women for terminating pregnancy. This induced mass protests known as Black Protest. It was the biggest, the most numerous protest in the times of Law and Justice, and the governing party got scared of the scale of this content. The idea of introducing laws which violate basic women's rights was abandoned because of the ruling party fear of losing next election. After that, the group of members of parliament filed a motion to the Constitutional Tribunal to review whether the accessibility of abortion for fetal abnormalities was consistent with the Polish constitution. This motion enabled to circumvent the parliamentary discussions and public consultation. At first, the motion was blocked. It was freezed, so-called zamożone. The tribunal chose not to proceed it, and this dodge was apparently the effect of a political request from the Law and Justice. After the parliamentary elections won by Law and Justice once again in 2019, the second identical motion was filed by the members of parliament. The Constitutional Tribunal was free to decide when to proceed it because the Act on Constitutional Tribunal grants the president of the tribunal with freedom to decide about the date of hearing in the cases concerning individual rights and freedoms. During the coalition crisis in September 2020, Law and Justice needed to satisfy the far right wing of the coalition. The public suddenly learned that the motion will be proceeded, and the ruling was delivered, as we all know, in the middle of the pandemic. Because of the serious legal doubts whether the composition of the tribunal is legitimate, many lawyers indicate that it is not a ruling of a tribunal, but rather a statement made by a group of individuals without any legal consequences. And I will add also that the member of parliament who filed a motion to the tribunal to ban abortion is now the most serious candidate for the position of ombudsman in Poland. The third issue is balancing the constitutional values. The Constitutional Tribunal in the current term of office, as well as in the previous terms of office, issued rulings which limited women's reproductive rights. In 1997, it declared the abortion due to social considerations as unconstitutional. The tribunal was always rather conservative about women's rights and their ability to make choices about their bodies. It was a reflection of a conservative shift in Poland after the collapse of the Polish People's Republic. The constitution is a unique legal act with a unique language. It uses very broad notions and articulates very general values, but some of them clash, and the role of the tribunal is to balance these values. In the case of the abortion ban, the fundamental reference provision was the right to life, Article 38 of the Constitution. The inherent dignity of a person, another article, was only a complementary reference norm. Constitutional norms such as equality of men and women, right to private life, freedom to make decisions about one's private life, protection of health were not taken into appropriate consideration. And in the end, I will just add that 2 vota separata were announced to the 2020 ruling. One of them was Leon Kieres, the so-called old tribunal member, last judge elected by the Civic Platform. The second was Piotr Szczółkowski, elected by Law and Justice. They emphasized that the ruling will enhance illegal abortion underground in Poland. Thank you.
Thank you, Katarzyna. And I would hand the floor then to Agnieszka. You're muted.
Sorry, it reminds me of some spiritual senses when, you know, everybody's, are you there? Unmute yourself, say something. Anyway, I will be talking about the human rights or potential human rights consequences of the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal. And yeah, I also have a short PowerPoint to share. Can you see it? Yeah, okay, perfect. So basically, I'm just going to start by saying, repeating what Katarzyna already said, that the 1993 law on family planning is extremely strict in terms of women access to legal abortion. It allows abortion only in those 3 cases, that is pregnancy, when it endangers the mother's life or health, when the prenatal test or other medical findings find that the fetus is severely impaired, or when there are strong grounds for believing that the pregnancy is a result of criminal act or rape. However, at the level of the European Court of Human Rights, that is the body that Poland joined democratically in 1993, and it's now a member of the Council of Europe, which means that every citizen of Poland who feels that their rights have been violated and they have exhausted the domestic remedies, that is, went through all the levels of courts in Poland, they can appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. And in the despite the fact that wearing my sociological hat now, the legal abortions in Poland are really at the level of 1,000. We had 1,110 abortions legal abortions in 2019, which compared to other Catholic country like Ireland, which had 6,000 abortions in 2019, or even our neighbor from the south, very small Czech Republic, which had 18,000 legal abortions, right? So the scale of legal abortion in Poland is really, really tiny, which means that the law is strict and Polish women do not take lightly to that legal abortion. And despite this, all the cases that actually reach the European Court of Human Rights deal with the inability to enforce even the existing legal procedures, right? Even the existing law that is already there and that is already strict. So we are talking about case Tysiąc versus Poland, which concerned from 2007, which concerned a woman who, as a result of her pregnancy, could become effectively blind. We are talking about P&S versus Poland 2012, which concerned an underage girl who became pregnant as a result of rape and was humiliated, harassed, and manipulated in her quest for legal abortion. And the case that I would like to particularly focus on today is RR versus Poland, because it specifically deals with the condition for abortion that was deemed unconstitutional last Thursday, and it concerned a lack of access to a timely prenatal examination in order to make an informed decision whether to or not continue with the pregnancy. I just want to say that in all three cases, the European Court of Human Rights found that there was a violation either of Article 8, right to private or family life, or Article 3, prohibition of inhuman and degrading treatment. And the case of Mrs. R makes a particular somber reading. As a sociologist, I'm interested in people's stories behind those cases. So let me tell you, Mrs. R was 29 years old. She was married, and this was her third pregnancy. During the initial ultrasound scan, the doctor suspected a severe genetic abnormality of the fetus, either Edwards or Turner syndrome. But they withheld specialistic tests until the time limit for abortion has expired. That is after the 23rd week of pregnancy. Mrs. R saw 16 doctors privately and within the remit of the public health system. She was admitted to several hospitals and clinics. She even traveled to see doctors from outside of her region in Poland. On at least 4 occasions, she asked, because she had 5 ultrasound scans, which said that there was some abnormality. So at least on 4 occasions, she demanded access to legal abortion if the specialist test confirmed the nature of genetic abnormalities. She finally received a doctor's certificate that a fetus had, I quote, chromosomal aberration indicating the presence of congenital defects which can have serious impact on the child's normal development. And it further said that the specialist doctor's certificate stated that further handling of the case under the provision of the 1993 law, so the family planning on termination of pregnancy can be envisaged. A relevant decision should be taken with due regard to the parent's opinion. But when Mrs. R received that note, it was already too late for an abortion, and she subsequently gave birth to a child with a Turner syndrome. So the court, the European Court of Human Rights, held that Mrs. R's rights under Article 3, prohibition of inhuman and degrading treatment, and Article 8, right to private and family life of the Convention, have been breached, and allowed her 45,000 euros compensation. Why I'm bringing this case, it's because it's the first time that the European Court of Human Rights used Article 3, which is a quite serious article. It's quite core convention right, prohibition of inhuman and degrading treatment, in case about female reproductive rights. And the court observed, and I quote him from Zurich, that women who are obstructed in their efforts to obtain legal and available medical services suffer a particularly acute form of pain that is more likely to amount on inhuman and degrading treatment. So the court doesn't just dish out this article lightly. There has to be a level of severity that one's condition has reached before that article has been broken, before that before the court will declare that this was inhuman and degrading treatment. So in the judgment of Mrs. R, what happened? The court said that Mrs. R was in a situation of a great vulnerability. Like any other pregnant woman in her situation, she was deeply distressed by information that the fetus could be affected by some malformation. It was therefore natural that she wanted to obtain as much information as possible so as to find out whether the initial diagnosis was correct, and if so, what was the exact nature of the ailment. She also wanted to find out about the options that were available to her, and as a result of the procrastination of the health professionals, she had to endure weeks of painful uncertainty concerning the health of the fetus, her own and her family's future, and the prospect of raising a child suffering from incurable ailment. And she suffered, the court thought that she suffered acute anguish through having to think about how she and her family would be able to ensure the child's welfare, happiness, and appropriate long-term medical care. So with the ruling of the Constitutional Tribunal that we heard last Thursday, this condition for abortion has been now deemed unconstitutional. So what next? How else can the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights develop, and what else can we see will be happening? I'm not a very big fan of saying foreseeing the future, but so I will be using the the jurisprudence we already have to make sort of an informed choice. Well, 2 things to really look out, which is how the court will be balancing the principle of margin of appreciation with states' positive obligation regarding access to healthcare and prenatal diagnostics within this emerging Article 3 jurisprudence. Okay, this is a little bit of a mouthful, so I'm going to divide it into two, because basically the court has to balance two ideas. First is the margin of appreciation, and this is basically the principle from which the European Court of Human Rights operates. In other words, the court works from the premise that national governments have their own laws, constitutions, and are therefore best suited to decide whether there has been or has not been a violation of human rights under their jurisdictions. And this really happens to preserve the plurality and diversity, and also endorse diversity of values within the European human rights space. So, for example, any decisions against Ireland until 2018 had to bear in mind that Ireland had in their constitution until 2018 that the right of the unborn is equal to the life of the mother, that the constitution explicitly acknowledged the life of the unborn to the mother, equal to the mother. So in the case A, B, and C versus Ireland, which concerned 3 women who traveled from Ireland to the UK to have abortion, and as a result suffered physical and psychological difficulties and cost of the travel abroad, the court found that Irish law prohibiting the applicants A and B from terminating their pregnancies in Ireland for health and well-being reasons interfered with their right to family life, so interfered with the right to Article 8. However, the court also accepted Irish government's argument that the prohibition on abortion is reflects the moral aims of the Irish society, and the Irish state was best placed to assess the necessity of restrictions to meet these aims. So by analogy, if the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal becomes law in Poland and removes the right to legal abortion due to high risk of fetal abnormality, as reflecting the Polish state moral aims against the so-called eugenic abortion, then the European Court of Human Rights would have to consider it while balancing the prenatal life with women's health and well-being. But the second point is that, especially in that case of Mrs. R that I mentioned from Poland, the court has already acknowledged that lack of access to legal abortion in certain cases may amount to inhuman and degrading treatment. So the judgment of the Constitutional Tribunal, well, it hasn't been published yet, typical, but we have heard judges announcing it. And it speaks volumes about dignity of unborn life. However, what about the dignity of woman, the mother, and her right to be free from inhuman and degrading treatment? How many more Mrs. R's are we going to have in Poland who, in a state of great vulnerability, will be transferred from one hospital ward to another, from one specialist to another, because of the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal might be interpreted that it no longer necessitates ensuring that a pregnant woman have timely and effective access to diagnostic services? Will the decision of the tribunal inhibit medical consultation between the woman and her doctor? Will it interfere with state obligation to secure that the citizen's right to effective respect for their physical and psychological integrity? Will the decision cause serious system blockages in terms of access to the diagnostic services or antenatal medical care, or in extreme cases, deem redundant the assessment of the medical condition of the fetus? And finally, when combined with the risk of incurring criminal responsibility under the Polish Criminal Code, the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal is likely to have a further chilling effect on doctors when deciding whether the remaining requirements for legal abortion, so the point 1 and 3 that have not yet been touched, are met in that individual case. So I want to suggest a comparison to a case decided by the UN Human Rights Committee, so-called Mole versus Ireland. And it concerned Mrs. Mallet, who was an Irish national, and she was informed in the 21st week of the pregnancy that the fetus she was carrying had congenital heart defects and that the impairment might prove to be fatal. So, but the hospital told her that abortion is not possible in Ireland. It was 2013 or before 2013, so before the changes in the constitution where abortion became legal in Ireland. So the abortion was not legal in Ireland, and the doctor suggested maybe Mrs. Mallet actually travels abroad. A couple of days earlier, Mrs. Mallet was further informed that either the fetus would die in her uterus or after birth. So she traveled to the UK, was admitted to hospital, and she gave birth to a stillborn child. And in this case, the Human Rights Committee found that there was a violation of Article 7 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, because the law exacerbated the anguish associated with pregnancy affected by fetal abnormality. The fact that Mrs. Mellet had to endure mental and physical pain of carrying a dying fetus across a border to another country and at her own personal experiences with no support from the state was deemed inhuman. And the shame and stigma associated with criminalization of abortion in Ireland exacerbated Mrs. Mellet's suffering. So maybe the court will go this way, but one way or the other, it will have to balance these two different sets of arguments. This interpretation about the dignity of the woman, I actually found in one dissenting opinion of the ruling of the Polish Constitutional Court, and that was of the judge Pszczółkowski, who argued that the tribunal has insufficiently and marginally treated the complex matter of dignity of women and mothers. He said, "A woman has a full right to demand from the state the protection of her health and cannot be treated as an object or a mean to realize the constitutional role of a family. The dignity of a woman is no less important than the protection of unborn life. And demanding of women the heroic act is humiliating or indignified." He used the word niegodziwe in the common sense of the word. So it therefore, in my opinion, looks highly probable that the recent decision of the Polish Constitutional Tribunal might find its finale before the European Court of Human Rights. However, the question is how many women, as a result of this judgment, might be unnecessarily denied access to medical care, diagnostic services, and specialist antenatal examination in Poland before it is challenged. Thank you. And sorry if I overrun my time.
Thank you, Agnieszka. Yes, so there's been a discussion that's been ongoing, and Claudia was right to ask if anyone wants to indicate, like, give a question, especially on the legal aspect right now. Just please raise your hand, put your question in the chat, or just turn on your camera if you have any of the questions right now on the legal parts, because I think we probably save the questions on movement and also alliances between, like, international women's rights movement.
I believe Lara has a question. We have a hand up.
Oh, great. Go ahead, please.
My question is to do with the legality aspect. It's just that with the passing of these laws, like, are doctors now going to be incentivized in some way to withhold information from mothers, or how are doctors going to behave after this, do you think?
Can I answer? I mean, Lara, thank you so much. I think we are about to see. I mean, it's likely that the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal will send a chilling effect, and that has been acknowledged by the court in the earlier decision. So, for instance, in those three cases concerning female reproductive rights from Poland to the European Court of Human Rights, the first was by Ms. Tysiąc, who was to become effectively blind as a result, or her sight. And then the court only decided, okay, this is not inhuman and degrading treatment, because she might have become blind, not necessarily will. So it's going to be Article 8. So it decided to develop this within the jurisprudence of Article 8. However, the subsequent two cases, which is Mrs. R and the girl, the 14-year-old girl that was raped, it was Article 3. So, and in all those judgments, the court noticed that, sorry, we are now considering it as a much graver type of abuse of human rights, and but also we recognize that the medical profession in Poland might be being sent a chilling message by the fact that, you know, this is becoming much more strict, etc., etc. So I think we are to, and the court also acknowledged that absolutely the doctors, they have the clauses of the conscience. So in Polish, it's klauzula sumienia, which means that, you know, the European Court of Human Rights very much recognizes it, that if, you know, performing abortion is against your conscience, you just have to refer the patient to another doctor. So it's not like the court is putting pressure on the doctors. It's rather that the court accepts that there might be already internal pressures on the doctors in Poland. I'm sure. I'm sorry, it's a bit winded answer to your question.
I saw Jan and Anna. Anna, maybe you want to go first?
Just a quick comment. I just today saw that a discussion about constitution, Polish constitution, when it was being developed in the 90s, and there was really a discussion about putting the sentence that would put the also the sentence. How to say that? That put the start the ochronić, Aga? Protect the life from the very beginning. So it was an idea of some members of the parliament in the 1996 to put the life, protect the life from the very beginning, and it was not accepted by the Polish parliament at that point. So it was an idea not to protect the life from not to protect the fetus. So we might also think about whether any decisions of Polish tribunal, constitutional tribunal concerning abortion are in fact valid, because they are against the idea that was put in the constitution by its authors. So that's just, yeah, thank you.
Can I ask my question?
Please go ahead.
So this is not yet the law of the land, right? And the second point is this: I don't want to go into details, but it is a very interesting procedure when something becomes the law of the land. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but from the case from 2006-2007 on lustration on Polish universities, to which I was subjected because at that time I was the professor at Warsaw University, I learned then that an act becomes the law of the land the moment the monitor or the dziennik ustaw, monitor, whatever, the first copy, this was literally down to minutes, the first copy leaves the printing press. Now, the printing presses are controlled by the government, the executive branch. Moreover, the Constitutional Tribunal is simply controlled by Kaczyński. So they, as I already saw someone commented, they have an option of delaying publishing this law, well, technically as long as they want.
So I see a question of Maria Lewandowska here coming up on this. Do you want to read it yourself, or should I just read it?
Oh yeah, hi.
Okay.
So you said that blocking the printing of this decision is not a legitimate way out of, kind of retracting on that law. So what are possible legitimate moves? That's my question.
Can I ask the two speakers if you can respond? Or Marta, I see you raised your hand. Is that responding to this or to another issue?
Just wanted to add one little detail. Apparently, Julia Przyłębska is really pushing for a quick publication of it. And according to the government's legislative office website, it will be published on Monday.
Thank you. Agnieszka, Katarzyna, do you want to take up Maria's question?
Well, what are the legitimate moves out of this situation? Well, to be honest, I don't know. To be honest, I really don't know, and I think, and I'm happy that I don't have to know that, because I don't have the democratic mandate to decide what is the legitimate out of the situation. I would just like to really avoid a situation when we're gonna have and when we have jurisprudence on that developing before the European Court of Human Rights, because that means a woman having been denied access to control over their reproductive rights, who then would need to take the case to the court. And we know that those decisions take years. The child, by the way, from the our case is now 18 years old, because that case was decided in 2011, like I said, but all this was happening in 2002. 2001 and 2002. So Mrs. R gave birth to her daughter in 2002, July actually. So the child is now, came of age. And so it's not, I mean, it's not very hopeful to wait for such a long time for a decision by the European Court of Human Rights. So I would really like a Polish government, whichever that is, to basically realize that, you know, it's better to do it themselves, and do it in a way, ideally, that the Irish did it. So
may I ask, because there's also, I think, a great comment in the chat on this, Anna Zielinska, if you could share your insights on this.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for this webinar. It's awesome. So I just want to say that, first of all, I think that tribunal, kill me if I'm wrong, was right, unfortunately. I mean, this law is unconstitutional as it is stated within this legislation. And I think that it was waiting to be rebutted, and it was rebutted for good reasons. It was not rebutted for the reason of the sanctity of life, but for inequality, as you know, of treatment between healthy and unhealthy fetus. So Krystyna Pawłowicz has been fighting for this for ages, and she won. I mean, she has been fighting for this provision, to make this provision disappear for more than 10 years. So I think that the only thing that we can do right now is to propose a new legislation. As you know, Lewica Razem has proposed something a few days ago, where just they do not enter into the discussion about what kind of fetus or embryo has a right to live, etc. They just concentrate on women, right? So on the will of women. So that would be an interesting move. But I think that in a conservative society as Poland is right now, what should be really done is a new law that is formulated in an exact way that the Simone Veil did it in 1974, right? So the abortion should be prohibited as it was in France in 1974, but with this provision saying that the only case when the abortion cannot, when you can have an abortion that is not penalized, is the case when the women's distress, mental or physical, is to be taken into account. So something like that. I don't think that the expression right to abortion should be put forward in Poland today, but I think that something should be done in the spirit of the French law from 1974. So this is a general proposal. I think that 93 law should be just banned forever. It's really badly written if you take into account the details. If you see, sorry, I'm going to finish in a second, but if you read this law, you see that actually abortion is authorized if so the doctor can do abortion if the fetus is whatever problematic, and then you need to have the consent of the woman. The consent of the woman comes as a second issue in the 1993 legislation. So this should be completely abandoned. The will of the woman should be in the first place. So again, do not fight to make it back, and do not fight against this decision. We have to fight for a new legislation.
Thank you very much. Again, I encourage everyone to look into the chat. There's been, I think, a great discussion also kind of on the proposal that Andrzej Duda put forward. I would now hand back to Agnieszka, so we have enough time for our next three distinguished speakers to discuss another aspect of it.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, and it's been you've done a fantastic job, and thank you so much for all your comments and questions. I will read the chat afterwards because it's really difficult to both talk and read and yeah. But without further ado, I'm moving to the third panel now, which is on the socio-cultural consequences of the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal, including the response from the women and from the civil society. So without further ado, I will give first the floor to Marta Kotwas. And Marta, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Before I start, please let me know if everything is visible to everyone. Okay, the presentation is on. Is it okay?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm starting my timer now. I would like to focus on various types of political actors to maybe make a little bit of a bridge between what has been said already in the first panel about the political side of the current situation and what is really going on in Poland at the moment, the protests, the people who are responsible for triggering the protests, and also some that are responsible for shaping attitudes to the protests. Excuse me. First of all, whodunit? We already know that this legislation was passed by the constitutional, the ruling was made by the Constitutional Tribunal, but it is important to acknowledge that it was a result of the constitutional complaint made by 119 MPs, some of whom were from Law and Justice, from Confederacja, and from Cookies movement. Due to the politicization of the Constitutional Tribunal, I think it's beyond any doubt that political responsibility belongs here to Law and Justice and to some extent to Confederation. The other contributors to this current wave of protests who have been active in terms of proposing tightening of the legislations are, first of all, the Polish Church through informal and formal means has been pushing for similar changes in the past. Some non-governmental organizations who are responsible for the two initiatives from the last few years, Ordo Juris and Kaja Godek's Life and Family Foundation, and also far-right parties and organizations that support and align with those non-governmental organizations. Okay, my slideshow is definitely not working very well, so let me handle it like this. Okay, so from the moment that the protests broke out, we can see a variety of reactions in the parliament. The parliamentary actors can be divided into those three groups: firmly supporting, mildly supporting, and opposing the protests. Lewica, which is a very small club, is firmly supporting also the protesters. There are also a few MPs from the Civic Coalition. This is why it's kind of on the border, that have been active in the protests and offering legal help to the protesters and so on. Szymon Hołownia's the Poland 2050 movement is mildly supporting it, but we should bear in mind that this movement would not support liberalizing the abortion law. And Polish People's Party has proposed, on the one hand, a referendum on the matter, and also has proposed putting the the so-called compromise on abortion, so the just overruled law, into the constitution. And we also should note that, of course, Law and Justice is firmly against it. I'm not going to focus on the actions and statements of prominent politicians of Law and Justice. They are also here aligned with Confederacja, so far-right parties, some of whom actually cooperate with the anti-choice movements very closely, to the point of Kaja Godek running from Confederacja's lists for the European Parliament. Now, those actors are trying to kind of shift the attitudes in various ways. So in some cases, there is the message they're projecting is that the protests are in favor of keeping the law as it was, which is not exactly the case. Women's strike organizers are firmly trying to get rid of any free riders, anyone who would like to gain political support on the back of the strike, basically. Now, I think it is quite important to also mention some allies and opponents in the kind of wider supply side of the situation. So we have, on the one hand, media. Public media and right-wing media are, of course, strongly against the protests. Here is the selection of headlines run on Polish TV, basically accusing the protesters of anything from cannibalism, Satanism, to left-wing fascism. Mainstream media are mildly supporting the protest, but they have also been criticized for example, inviting conservative commentators, for perhaps focusing on the style of protests and questioning whether it is legitimate to divert some of the anger of the protesters against the church, and so on. We also have universities very strongly supporting the protests. Some surprises, football fan clubs. There were a few cases of football fan clubs making statements in support of the protests. And this is surprising because this is a group which is very often associated with the far right. There have been a few companies that announced publicly support for the protests, which can be followed by some boycott by right-wing consumers. But also, I think we should take into account celebrities and social media influencers, bearing in mind how, to what a great extent this protest is being organized online and is being attended by young people. Here is just one example of the outreach of, on the one hand, Jarosław Kaczyński, on the other hand, YouTube personality Krzysztof Gonciarz. You see the number of the views. Now the final bit. So in terms of the demands of the strike kobiet, they can be divided into 5 groups, as you can see in the slide. And when we look in detail at those demands, I think it is very visible that they go exactly, directly against policies that have already been introduced by Law and Justice government, such as limiting access to morning after pills, limiting fundings to IVF procedures, and so on. And in that sense, it can be framed as a protest that is political and that is anti-governmental. However, as I said at the very beginning, after Łukasz's question, this initial set of demands, which included resignation of the government, has been slightly shifted, and it does not include such political claims anymore. So, is it time for political change? It is very difficult to say. There have been a few polls published. They are inconclusive. Some of them show a significant drop for support for law and justice, some of them just a slight drop, and we still have too little data to decide for sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marta. Just exactly 7 minutes. Fantastic. And without further ado, I give the floor to Ania Radecka. Ania, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Aga, for this brilliant panel. There are so many ideas I have in mind, and it's all really hot because I'm in between organizing strike in Nowa Huta and going to strike in Krakow. But I have to say that we have the movement, the women's movement, the women's strike in Poland has come a long way from the 2016 protests till today. And I will try to share my screen and show you a picture from 2016. 2015. Wait. Quickly. Yes. So this is our group in Nowa Huta, which look like sad, maybe angry, but also sad women who are going on strike. And this has changed a lot today. So there are several reasons why that has happened, and I have listed some of them. We had, during the ruling of peace since 2015, we had many protests going on, as it has been said. But I think the most important are the activization of young people, and I mean very young people, like high schoolers, because they are very engaged in the climate activism, with the climate strikes, and which was, I think, the thing that the event that really mobilized young people and gave them space to organize, to find tools how to speak up. And they were already, so these young people were already active in the public sphere. We had also rise of the LGBTQ activism and the growing acceptance for this movement. If you compare the marches for tolerance in Poland, like in 2000s, it was 1,000 people on a march, and 2 years ago, with the last march in Krakow, it was, I don't know, 5,000-6,000 people, a lot young people. We had teacher strikes, we had doctor strikes, and this was all like going on. So the whole atmosphere was really, really hot in Poland, like maybe not hot. So people were angry, were dissatisfied with kind of everything. And then came the pandemic, which closed people, locked us in houses. And I guess everybody was just looking for a chance to protest. That was the idea. Everybody was just thinking what can happen, that people can start striking. And then we had this ruling of the tribunal, Constitutional Tribunal, and I think it was the starting point of the protest, women's protest, because we had an actor, that is the Strike Kobiet, who had the tools, the know-how, how to organize the protests, and so they could be the actor leading to massive mobilization. Because, for example, with teachers' strike, which was also touching most of the society, the parents, they didn't know how to do that. They didn't know how to connect to society. I think they just were closed in school, and there was no communication with the rest of the society. Whereas Strike Kobiet, with younger people on board, had this all also social media tools, other women's organization that could very quickly organize also protests on the streets and mobilize people. What I can see now is also, there's also a growing rise to feminism, acceptance of feminism in Poland. It has really changed since 2016. I think it was the beginning. So there were celebrities identifying as feminists, and there was the abortion is okay action, and the whole activity of non-governmental groups brought the acceptance of abortion to a broad public. Now what we can see is that young people, especially young women, have really this idea of their freedom and freedom of what they can do with their body, and you can see how they undermine the authorities of older men who are in charge, and these are priests, bishops, politics, of course, Kaczynski, but not only the president, the prime minister, but also journalists. And I send you later a link about the protest in Szczecinek, a really small town, when a group of high schoolers talk with a priest, and he totally doesn't understand what they are saying, and they say, "My body, my choice," and the priest is just looking at them, "What are you talking to me?" And then finally they just scream, the girls, they scream, "Show me your uterus," which is, I think, he doesn't understand it again. So this is what we have, just to sum up. I think what this protest is doing, it is the end of the conservatism in Polish politics. It is the end of the bad conservatives, that is peace, but also the good conservatives that are the former, for example, members of the tribunal who also ruled against abortion. That's all the politicians from peace, but also from Platforma. That is, of course, priests and bishops, and whatever is the end of this protest, which I don't know what is going to be, this is definitely a great shift toward not even liberalization, but even more progressive ideas in the Polish public sphere and Polish politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Ania, very much for showing this very much bottom-up perspective, what is happening on the ground. I know I was texting you about whether you would like to take part in this panel, and you texted me. I'll respond later. I'm on a protest at the moment, obviously showing me where am I in your priority list, which is absolutely fine, absolutely fine. Without further ado, I'm going to now, I'm very happy you talked about the protests, because now Katarzyna Zachęter will be talking about the language that is used by the protester, hopefully also infusing a bit of humor in here. So Katarzyna, I'm giving.
I don't know whether you can hear me. Can you hear me? I cannot hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. It's fascinating, and I am beginning to think that I am basically, what I will be talking about the language used by the three main actors, I will be illustrating many of your points. But what I wanted to look at is three distinct languages of the three main actors: the party, the street, and the church, although I need to stress that the language of the church, or a part of the church, is very much identical to the language of the party. One thing we have to give credit to peace, to law and justice, it is they are very consistent in their language, and they have been using the same language for the last 15 years. So the first thing they do, the first strategy that worked very well in the past, is basically connecting the opposition and the protests with Nazi Germany or some Western actors, and basically claiming that the strike uses Nazi logo, the lightning logo, yeah. And this was recently posted on Twitter by Ryszard Terlecki, who is the deputy marshal of the Sejm, but also by Archbishop Jędraszewski from Kraków. There's no similarities between the red lightning sign, and you can see it everywhere in Poland. For instance, on every sign saying electricity, be careful. And it's also part of the pop culture, like AC/DC has it. But by using it consistently, saying Nazi symbol, German symbol, the Western things, the people, those who do those things, they are basically linking the opposition with Nazi Germany. And the reason I said it is consistent is because they used it already in 2005 during the election of Lech Kaczyński versus Donald Tusk. They said that basically Donald Tusk's grandfather was a Nazi because he joined the German army. Then they toned it down to Dziadek z Wehrmachtu, grandfather in Wehrmacht, to the point that, for instance, Maria Bienieda, who was the honorary consul to Ottawa, she posted a digitally altered image showing Donald Tusk, who at the time was the European Council president, as a Nazi officer. And it is a fact, Tusk's grandfather was forced to join the army because he was a Kashub, and the choice was death or joining the army. But anyway, linking the symbol with the Nazi symbol and keeping in mind that in the past they used it successfully, making Tusk the Nazi, that worked very well, and they are using it right now. The second strategy is basically demonizing women rights activists and women in general, and using the anti-gender rhetorics. And the reason it works is because they already used it successfully to suggest the word feminist as a dirty word, F word. They create a very simplistic opposition, which is it's crude opposition, but very effective. So on one side you have Polish, Catholic, normal, traditional, good. And on the other side you have the Western, gender-oriented, abnormal, over-sexualized, perverted, vulgar, LGBT. So they can make this black and white opposition, and they are using it right now by consistently demonizing the women and using the term, which repeats itself all over the place, zwolenniczki aborcji. Suggesting that those women who want to have abortion as if they don't know if they wanted to have an ice cream. So basically they are moving it from the situation that the women are not supporters of abortion, but they are supporters of a woman's choice. Yeah, but by using zwolenniczki aborcji, the supporters of abortion, they make those women seem like monsters. And one of the examples, I will read it first in Polish and then in English, is protestujące feministki myślą, że zabijanie dzieci to ich prawa człowieka. The demonstrating feminists think that killing children is human right, their human right. Yeah. Now, what is really surprising, and especially for the generation who remembers martial law, is that the language used by the leading party hugely resembles the language of the late communism, the language of almost General Jaruzelski and the martial law. And some of those quotes sound as if they were said in December 1981, but actually they were said now. So one of them is brutalna gra kosztem życia Polaków, the brutal game costing Poles their lives. That's one quote. Other, chaos and violence, they are basically going to, chaos and violence are the beginning of coup d'etat. The new thing is the leftist fascism. So the quote is, the Poles are united against the leftist fascism that is destroying Poland. And basically, let me read another quote by Marcierewicz on his, I think it's on his Twitter account. Thank you to everyone who are defending churches, life, and Poland. And the ending of this quote is, we will not allow Antifa, TVN, and the enemies of Poland to manipulate our children. Now, why children matter here? Because we will not let the West corrupt our children. That's what Kaczynski has been saying, and that's how they are trying to connect children with pedophilia. But this is the language. This is the language used by the party. And of course, as if this was in October 2016 during the first strikes, there's absolutely no discussion of the actual issue. Now, the language of the peace and the language of the protests is very different. And there are two accusations sort of used against it, that it is vulgar, and this question that it is vulgar or it shouldn't be vulgar, women shouldn't talk like this. So that's also said by some women. I would think it's a generational issue here, but this is repeated by the government all the time. And especially the use of the word wypierdalać. I'm sorry that I will be swearing, but there's no way to do it differently. So please fuck off or fuck off. This word, however, which became one of two...
Katarzyna, sorry, 1 minute. Because
okay.
there are people asking.
I will try to speed it up. So this particular word, however, appeared in politics already in July 2018, and it is not the protesters who used it, but it was the judge Konrad Wytrykowski who actually started an action to send postcards to Judge Gerstow, who Kaczyński wanted to push out, and he suggested to send postcards to her with the word wypierdalać. So I don't know to what degree the word used by the protesters have something to do with it, but it definitely shows the anger. And this is also supported by the fact that a lot of posters says, miło już było, we were nice. Yeah. And also one of the interesting things which did not exist in earlier protests is a lot of humor. So for instance, the feminine element of the protest, I am kindly asking you to fuck off, or making it as a joke, the cat can stay, Kaczyński has a cat, yeah. The cat can stay, but peace can fuck off. Also, for instance, this is one of the accusations that the government throws at the protesters, that they are using children for it. Now, when you think about Polish history and the concept of Orlęta Lwowskie, or the monument of the small Warsaw Uprising, the insurgent from the Warsaw Uprising, the little boy, yeah? So using this element that now the women are those supporters of the protests are basically corrupting children. Now, the last part would be the church, and as I said, to a very high degree, it resembles the language of the part of the piece. However, they also found some quotes in the Bible, such as from Luke chapter 10. I saw a Satan like a lightning. So they are trying to suggest that the feminists are somehow connected with Satanism, and this was also repeated by the Minister of Education, Czarnek, who said, I see here the elements of Satanism in those protests. So to conclude, the language suggests three things. One, the piece sort of resorts to the language it used and knew it worked, but also surprisingly to the language of the late communism. The church, the language of the church, and it is not the entire church. There are some groups of church like Tygodnik Powszechny and Więź, and even Prymat Polak, suggesting that because the church discussed it, the majority of church seems to be in support, is against the protests, but some groups, as I mentioned, Tygodnik Powszechny and Więź, are against it. One thing that is very, very clear, it seems that the church lost its status as a moral guide. And there's videos that you see women screaming at the priests or telling to them F off. This suggests that the church does not have any moral authority any longer for quite a few, especially the younger generation of women. And you could argue that 50 years of communism did not destroy the church in the bit. But the last 5-10 years of the last 5-10 years basically destroyed the church as the older generation knew. So that would be my conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katarzyna. I would like to now open the floor. I mean, there is a really parallel world happening in the chat. I mean, not parallel, but an amazing commentary. And just bringing it all up would take me a really long time. However, I had a comment from Alexandra Jacyk, who is asking Katarzyna in specific, are there any references to communist and Soviet times? And then Agata Zielińska is raising that it's such an interesting point about the use of children in that language. Now, Ben, would you like to come in with this polite versus impolite modes of protest and how it relates to violence, non-violence? Ben? Oh yeah,
Can
great.
you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, this was just an issue that I wanted to raise just as a general question or theme for comment from all the participants really, is the question of whether the panel think that the tone of the protest is productive or counterproductive. On the one hand, we have language which is being used, which is clearly also in terms of who it's being directed towards, is clearly taboo busting, and in that sense is sort of almost unprecedented in recent memory in Poland. On the other hand, we have voices suggesting that what might the effect of this might be, particularly as the protests go on, is to alienate more moderate potential allies who perhaps agree with the aims of the protesters, but are put off by the idiom of the protest. I'd like to hear what the panelists think on this question.
Perfect. I would also like to invite Richard Butterwing-Pawlikowski. He has a point to make. And after Richard, Michał Morawski, who's been waiting quite some time. Richard? Sorry. Oh, you probably need to unmute.
I'm looking for...
Okay.
Oh. Letting me in. This has been a very interesting and important discussion. Oh, and apologies for the background, which was part of Martin Rady's class yesterday, his request. It's nothing to do with the current discussion. But one of the Kaczynski and Macierewicz and people of their ilk have been saying that the protesters are part of a campaign to destroy Polishness. And are utterly opposed to sort of Polish tradition and the sort of the moral deposit of the past. And yet on Wednesday evening, I saw something quite extraordinary. Just outside the headquarters of PiS on Nowogrodzka Street, there was a huge crowd of mainly 18-year-olds who were dancing the Polonaise to the music of Wojciech Kilar, to Andrzej Wajda's film of Pan Tadeusz, the 1834 masterpiece by Adam Mickiewicz. This is what they would normally do 100 days before their matriculation exam, the so-called studniówka. In many cases, they were denied that possibility this year. And it is, of all the possible dances, the most Polish and the most polite. What could be a more subversive way of countering the narrative that the protesters are out to destroy Polish tradition than by dancing the Polonaise?
Thank you very much, Richard. Okay, because I'm a little bit conscious of time, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to also gather the voices who earlier wanted to ask a question. So I'm going to now give Michał Morawski speak, and then there was Krystian Fidanowski. He had a good comment. And if anybody else would like to answer a question, let me know in the chat. And then after gathering this, I will give the speakers who want to talk about, who want to answer, can you please put a reaction on your screen? So then I will give you a voice, because maybe not everybody wants to respond. So Michał Morawski.
I think the first question that I wanted to thank, by the way, this is a really fascinating discussion, and I'm kind of speaking quickly because I have to rush off to a class in a minute. But I just wanted to ask about the question of populism. It's very helpful to see this through the lens of populism in some respects, but is this really a question of populism, given that, as Agnieszka and Marta emphasized and others did too, Poland has had extremely restrictive abortion laws throughout the entire post-communist period, well, since 1993, and successive liberal governments have upheld these extremely kind of reactionary, frankly, abortion laws, and you know, this change is awful. But in terms of the extent of its, radicalization of what was already in place, I don't think that the Polish pluralists have a much more, if we oppose pluralists to populists, are radically different in this respect. And the horrendous statements by what's his name, the former president of the Constitutional Tribunal today, who was dismissed by PiS, who referred to the protesters as a hołota, as a riffraff, as a rabble, using these very kind of classed language as well. And secondly, just very quickly, with regards to the legacies of the Polish People's Republic, I think it will be interesting to have a discussion about the political aesthetics of the also bizarre, terrifying address to the nation by Jarosław Kaczyński. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michał. Can I now ask Christian Fidanowski to comment?
Yes, I already asked my question in the chat. So my question was about the civic coalition, which was, according to one of the earlier slides, portrayed as being ambivalent towards the protests. So I was just wondering, what is this possible strategy behind this? Are they afraid of maybe alienating PIS voters? Or do they just, because public opinion, as was mentioned before, is actually even including many PIS voters not in favor of the changes. So what is the reasoning behind this? And are they maybe assuming that public opinion will eventually fall in line with the government and this is something that they're afraid of? So they're still being strategic in that regard.
Thank you very much, Christian. So now I'm going to give voice to all the panelists. So starting from Jan, then Richard, Carolyn, yeah, and then we're going to, for the last reaction.
I have several points, as you can imagine, but I will just respond to Michał, and Michał and I have had this conversation not once. I think that the context, political context matters, and conservatives and right-wing populists are simply different political animals. And that's why they gave you that list of things. Conservatives, basically, the basic conservative stance is to follow the rule of law. Right-wing populists are the destructors of the rule of law. And listening to you, you may know this book, but this is the best catalog of what they've already accomplished that has been so far published, perhaps. A book by Wojciech Sadurski, which in great detail illustrates the total damage that is already being done to the Polish order, institutional order. And I think that the processes simply play differently in the situation where you have conservatives that we may not like who are staking their position, and certainly PO is like that. But it is a completely different ballgame, and we have to take it very seriously, because this is not a conservative party anymore. This is right-wing populist party.
Richard?
Yes, so I would agree. I mean, I think there is a distinction between sort of nationalists and the sort of the national populists. I mean, the research I did with Agnieszka Kubik, one of the things that we were concerned about was that sort of nationalism was too broad. And so we sort of looked at sort of people who are just sort of proud of the nation, like dancing the Polonaise, and those who are sort of see Polish national identity as being permanently under threat and not given the sort of the due respect it deserves. And it was this sort of subgroup of sort of Polish nationalists who were very much sort of in line with sort of populist thought, who were the ones that were much more likely to see sort of homosexuality as a threat, and therefore were the ones who were being sort of influenced much more by sort of populist rhetoric and not just sort of more general nationalist rhetoric.
Carolyn?
Yeah, great. So yeah, I mean, there's been so much great stuff being said today. I think just one thing is that it's a lot about rule of law, and I think this is also something that Brussels should take note of, given that we're still debating the multi-annual financial framework, and the question of rule of law, conditionality or other issues to work on this, because this is not just a question of populism. I think this is also a question of liberal democracy at its core. Just as the final point from my side.
Katarzyna?
Yes.
Sorry, Andrejuk, sorry. Yeah, Katarzyna Andrejuk, go. No problem.
As a final remark, just I would like to let you know that the controversy around the Constitutional Tribunal is only a small part of many legal controversies which surround the Polish justice reforms implemented by the Law and Justice Party. These reforms concern numerous judicial institutions, not only Constitutional Tribunal, but also Supreme Court, Common Courts, the National Council for the Judiciary, and all these changes weaken the separation of powers, threaten the judicial independence in many aspects.
Thank you. Marta?
Thank you very much. I wish we had more time, really. So
Sorry.
just very briefly, on Michał's question, I think it's a very good way of putting it. I would agree with Jan that this is something that kind of belongs to the populist repertoire, the way that Law and Justice, their media, their newspapers and so on are constructing this whole opposition. Whether or not this is a conflict that has this kind of culture war in its core, this is something debatable especially if we take into account the level of support for tightening the abortion law in Poland, which according to recent polls is around between 11 and 13%. So it might be, you know, a bit of a missed call for Law and Justice to use that kind of strategies, because it really seems that the issue resonates with a vast part of the society. On the question on civic coalition, they are mildly supportive, not ambivalent. They were kind of in the middle, but mildly supportive. I think this is because the majority of civic coalition are usually in favor of the compromise, so of the current legislation. And it might be also due to misreading the vibe of the protests. They did, some prominent politicians from civic coalition did criticize the protesters for entering the churches, for the language, for the style and so on. This was really not well received. They received a lot of backlash. And on that note, on Ben's question about productivity, I think it is that style of protest, that temperature of protest, and also inventiveness, I'm sorry, of the protesters in terms of kind of enacting it, is productive in terms of its mobilizing potential. It really speaks to the youth. It really speaks to a lot of people who are just fed up with government that is breaking human rights, that is violating all sorts of kind of standards that we would expect to be met in a country that is a member of the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anya?
So, a few points. As to patriotism, what you can hear is really these young people, they feel patriotic. They place it in their songs. They talk about taking care of Poland and its future. So it's really there, and the Polonez is not there by coincidence. As to the language, what I can observe, many moderate supporters, they say, we understand the language, we don't use it. For example, they would not scream, yes, and so, fuck off, but they would say, we can understand that, and this is really came to this point that we have to use that. And as to more general remark, I think what we have here is the end of the general agreement in the third after the transition, and really people now are undermining the general agreement on how to do politics that is done by men, that is done by elderly men, and you can see that in how civil coalition is reacting. They don't understand, I think, these protests, and they don't voice up the protesters' demands. I think also people do not have have problem also with the Constitutional Tribunal in general, because the cards weren't really supporting even either women's rights, for example, victims of sexual violence, or the social justice things like reprivatization. So there's a really wide critique of Polish justice system on the left. These protesters and this protest also I guess points to this this idea that the whole way the politics was done and the justice system was built is unjust, and especially unjust to women. And I think, last but not least, I think the protest is not will be not hijacked by other issues, because you can see a wide support from men of this protest, and there are support for their women. And what we have said, that the farmers are supporting, the miners are supporting, the football fans are supporting the protest, and it is really and also the movement is working to keep this abortion right in the center, and I hope it will stay that way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonia. And Katarzyna, the last word.
I think that what the protest and the language of the protest shows very, very clearly is that women are actually angry. Despite all this vulgarity or humor, they are actually angry. They don't want to no longer be a part of a patriarchal society, and it is supported by men. So there's a huge generational change, yeah? And this widening agenda suggests it's not just about the abortion, because there are LGBT issues, there are quite a few other issues. And by comparison to earlier, like the women's strikes in October 2016, the patriotic elements are less visible, much less visible. But the anger, real anger, is visible. So I think the change is coming. For those who remember the martial law, and who remember solidarity, I see it almost in this with the same, the things are happening with the speed. First, there were a few strikes, then more strikes, then more people, the agenda started to be very wide. Yeah, it started with the abortion. Right now, within 8 days of protest, the agenda is much wider and the anger is growing. So I see similarities between the end of communism and the things that is happening right now. But what is really important, I think this is the end of the patriarchal society, both by men and women. And when you look, I spent a lot of time looking at the protesters. What's the percentage are men? I cannot tell what the percentage are men, but this is a large percentage. It's not 1 or 2 men here or there. Yeah. So I think this might be a huge cultural change of the end of the Polish patriarchal Catholic, the Rydzyk type of Catholic society.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your really fascinating comments, presentations, ideas. I mean, how the chat was flowing was really, really amazing. Thank you so much for jumping on the idea that let's do something, and it's in a very, very short time span. And I know how you are all busy, because it's all teaching, and it's teaching in a different way. I mean, so first of all, I would really like to thank to all the panelists and all the presenters. Big, big, big thank you from me. And also, if there is further interest in continuing taking the temperature of those events in Poland as they follow, I'll be happy to keep organizing maybe events to see. I mean, events like this to take the temperature, to comment on things as they are unfolding. So we've overrun by 8 minutes, and yet I've heard from many of you that this is not enough time. But I think, and we had a fluctuating audience. At some point, we had over 150 people here on the Zoom call. So thank you all very much. Wishing you a lovely weekend and a great evening. Thank you so very much for taking part. And yes, stay tuned, because this is not the end of Polish rights in Poland. So take care.
Agnieszka, I